What if I told you that one empire reshaped the entire identity of Persia, turning it from a land divided by tribes and traditions into the heart of a new religious world order? And what if the very force that unified it also sealed its fate in centuries of conflict that still echo today? This is the story of the Safavid Empire, the rise of a dynasty born from mystics, forged by warriors, and crowned in blood and faith. In the late 15th century, when Persia lay in ruins after Mongol and Timurid invasions, a boy barely into his teens would rise from the mountains of Azerbaijan and declare himself the shadow of God on earth. His name was Ismail, and his destiny, to build a kingdom not only of soldiers and scholars, but of spirit, a Shi'a empire that would forever divide the Islamic world. But how did a teenage zealot carve out a Persian Renaissance from chaos? And how did a spiritual brotherhood become a world power feared by both Ottomans and Mughals? Tonight, we journey deep into the heart of one of history's most dramatic transformations, the birth, glory, and eventual decline of the Safavid Empire. The child who would be king. The story begins in the shadow of collapse. It's the late 1400s. The Mongols are long gone, but their destruction still lingers like smoke over Persia. Cities once glittering with scholars and poets, Tabriz, Shiraz, Isfahan, stand half empty, haunted by the ghosts of their golden age. Power lies scattered among Turkic warlords, tribal militias, and mystic sects. And in this chaos, a spiritual brotherhood quietly grows, the Safaviya order. It began as a humble Sufi movement founded by Sheikh Safi al-Din Ardabili in the 14th century. A man of peace, he preached piety, simplicity, and devotion to God. But over the generations, his descendants transformed the order into something far more militant. Part faith, part army, part prophecy. By the time young Ismail was born in 1487, the Safaviya was no longer a circle of mystics. It was a revolutionary machine waiting for a leader. Ismail's childhood was anything but ordinary. His father, Sheikh Haydar, had already clashed with the mighty Aq Koyunlu Confederation and paid for it with his life. The family went into hiding, and the boy, barely a child, became both orphan and symbol. Safavid followers whispered of divine protection around him. They called him the hidden Imam's chosen one, destined to purify Persia and avenge his father's death. By the age of 12, Ismail was no longer a boy in hiding. He emerged from the mountains with only a few hundred loyal Qizilbash warriors, fanatically devoted soldiers, wearing red 12-pointed headgear, symbolizing their allegiance to the 12 Shia Imams. To them, Ismail wasn't just a leader. He was a messiah. Imagine the Sinan adolescent, slender and pale, mounted on horseback beneath a crimson banner embroidered with the words, Ya Ali. He spoke softly, but with divine conviction. The tribes followed. Town after town fell before this fiery youth. And as the legends grew, so did his army. In 1501, the boy who had been hunted now entered Tabriz, the jewel of Azerbaijan. In a single day, he crowned himself Shah of Persia and proclaimed 12 Shi'ism the official faith of his empire. For the first time in centuries, Persia had both a ruler and a vision. But that vision would set the entire Islamic world ablaze. The declaration was bold, almost suicidal. The majority of Persia's people was still Sunni. The neighboring Ottoman Empire, Sunni to its core, watched in fury as this young king redefined not just borders, but belief itself. But for Ismail, this was no political game. He believed God had chosen him to restore the true path. And so began one of the most radical cultural revolutions in Middle Eastern history. He sent preachers and soldiers across the land, commanding conversions. Mosques were rebuilt. New rituals emerged. The Persian heartland, long a crossroads of empires, became something newer. Shia nation. For the first time since the fall of ancient Persia, identity and faith merged into a single flame. But, behind the glory, the boy king's confidence teetered on the edge of hubris. He claimed invincibility, that no sword could harm him, that divine light shielded his body. His followers believed it too. They charged into battle with blind devotion, convinced their Shah was a living saint. It was this faith, glorious yet dangerous, that propelled the Safavid banner across Iran, the Caucasus, and Mesopotamia, and for a time, It worked. Ismail's charisma united tribes that had fought for generations. His empire grew rapidly. Stretching from the Caspian to the Persian Gulf, poets returned to the cities. Artisans rebuilt the shrines, and a cultural renaissance flickered to life. The Persian language, long overshadowed by Arabic and Turkish, found its voice again in the courts of the Safavids. The age of Persian art, poetry, and architecture was being reborn under a red flag of faith. But power invites enemies, and Ismail's greatest test was waiting, just beyond his western border. The Ottomans, under the fierce Sultan Selim I, viewed the Safavids as heretics who threatened the unity of Islam. What began as a spiritual revival soon became a geopolitical storm. In 1514, two worlds collided at the Battle of Chalderona, confrontation that would decide not just empires, but destinies. The Ottomans brought cannons and disciplined the Safavids brought zeal, cavalry, and unshakable belief. Ismail, still young and untested against such power, refused to adapt. He believed divine favor would carry the day. The result was catastrophic. Ottoman artillery tore through the Safavid ranks. Thousands perished. Ismail himself barely escaped, his myth of invincibility shattered. For the first time, his people saw not a prophet, but a man. The psychological wound ran deep. Ismail retreated from politics and turned inward, composing poetry filled with sorrow and mystical longing. Yet even in defeat, something extraordinary endured. The Safavid state survived. The Shia identity he had forged could not be erased by cannon fire. It had taken root in the soil of Persia, in the hearts of its people. Ismail's dream lived on, and it would soon be carried forward by successors who transformed that fragile faith-born kingdom into a true empire. The boy who began as a mystic's heir had become a legend, a flawed, fiery founder whose vision would outlast his own despair. But as Persia rebuilt after Chaldron, the question remained: could an empire born in faith survive in a world of power? And that question would define the next chapter of the Safavid saga. The empire of silk and sword, Abbas the Great, and the Persian Renaissance. Have you ever wondered what happens when a dream survives its own destruction? When faith, once forged in blood, must learn to live in the shadow of politics and power. The story of the Safavid Empire did not end with Ismail's fall. It was only beginning its transformation. The fire that had burned too wildly under its founder now smoldered, gathering strength for a second, greater blaze. After the crushing defeat at Chaldron, Persia was broken, but not dead. Shah Ismail's silence had left a void, and into that void crept chaos. His successors inherited not a thriving kingdom, but a trembling shell-torn, apart by tribal rivalries and foreign invasions. His son, Tahmasp I, ascended to the throne as a frightened child, surrounded by scheming Qizilbash chiefs. For decades, Persia lived under the rule of men who believed more in the power of their tribes than the throne. But Tahmasp was no fool. Behind his quiet demeanor lay a patient mind. He watched the factions tear each other apart and learned from them. Slowly, he strengthened his own grip, curbing the ambitions of the Qizilbash and establishing a sense of fragile order. He brought Persian artisans back to court, encouraged poetry and trade, and fortified cities against endless Ottoman and Uzbek attacks. For the first time since Ismail's fall, the Safavid heart began to beat again. Yet Tahmasp's reforms were cautious, defensive, a holding pattern, not a rebirth. It would take another man to breathe life into the fading flame. That man would come not from divine revelation, but from human cunning. In 1588, as the empire teetered once again on the brink of collapse, a 17-year-old boy seized the throne through a daring coup. His name was Abbas. Shah Abbas I was no mystic prophet. He was a realist, and that made him dangerous. He had grown up in a palace soaked in intrigue, where brothers betrayed brothers, and generals treated kings like pawns. From a young age, he understood that survival meant deception, patience, and, above all, control. When he became Shah, Persia was being torn apart by rebellion and invasion. The Ottomans held the west, the Uzbeks, the northeast, and the capital, Qazvin, was little more than a court of trembling courtiers. Abbas faced the same question that haunted Ismail decades before. How do you unite a fractured people under one banner? But, unlike Ismail, Abbas would not rely on zeal. He would rely on structure. His first move was audacious. He turned his back on the Qizilbash, the very warriors who had made the Safavid throne possible. They had become too powerful, too unpredictable, loyal only to their tribes. To break them, Abbas created something Persia had never seen: a standing army loyal only to the crown. He drew his soldiers from the Circassian and Georgian slaves, taken in wars gulams, trained in firearms, drilled in discipline, and rewarded through merit, not birth. With these men, Abbas rebalanced the scales of power. For the first time, the Shonot, the tribes, commanded the empire's sword. Then came the rebuilding. He made peace with the Ottomans, temporarily, sacrificing territory to buy time. He reorganized taxation, reformed administration, and secured trade routes long haunted by bandits. He moved the capital from Kazvin to a new Isfahan, a city destined to become a marvel of the world. Isfahan rose like a dream from the desert. Abbas envisioned it not merely as a capital, but as a symbol of rebirth, a canvas on which the Persian spirit could paint itself anew. Under his command, the Nakshi Jahan Square was constructed, one of the largest public spaces ever built. Around it rose mosques shimmering with blue tiles, palaces whose walls were lined with mirror and gold, and markets bursting with silk, porcelain, and gems. The city became a living monument to power, a place where merchants from Venice and India haggled under Persian arches while scholars recited poetry in candlelit chambers. Abbas was not just building a city, he was crafting an image, a declaration that Persia was not a dying ember, but a phoenix reborn. He opened the empire's doors to trade with Europe, welcoming English and Dutch merchants eager to bypass Ottoman intermediaries. Persian silk became a currency of power. Art, architecture, calligraphy all flourished, as if the ghosts of Ismail's dream had finally found peace. But power rarely grants peace for long. Behind the splendor, Abbas carried a shadow darker than any of his predecessors, a deep, gnawing mistrust. He had seen betrayal too closely to ever forget it. As his empire expanded, so did his paranoia. He began to see traitors in his own family. One by one, he turned on his sons, the very heirs who might have secured his dynasty. One was executed, another blinded, and a third imprisoned for life. The court that once glowed with brilliance now whispered with fear. Still, Abbas's ruthlessness brought results. When he finally broke peace with the Ottomans in 1603, he did so with precision. His reformed army swept across the battlefield with deadly efficiency. Tabriz, Baghdad, and the lost provinces of the west fell once more under Persian control. Even the Uzbeks, long a plague in the northeast, were crushed. For the first time in centuries, Persia stood strong from the Caucasus to the Gulf, a unified, wealthy empire, admired and feared alike. And yet, Abbas's victories came at a terrible cost. The old Qizilbash elite, who had once carried the Safavid banner with religious devotion, were now humiliated and bitter. The Ghalams, though loyal, were foreigners at heart, dependent on the Shah's favor but detached from the Persian soul. Abbas had built a system so centered on his own authority that it could not breathe without him. The same control that had saved Persia would, in time, suffocate it. As the years passed, Abbas's glory turned to solitude. In the grand palaces of Isfahan, surrounded by mirrors and painted ceilings, the aging Shah often walked in disguise through the city he had built. He listened to the chatter of merchants and the laughter of children by the river. They still spoke his name with reverence, but also with fear. Some said he was a tyrant who had murdered his future. Others called him the savior of Persia. Both were right. In 1622, Abbas reached the pinnacle of his reign when his forces, aided by the English fleet, drove the Portuguese from Hormuz, seizing control of one of the richest ports in the world. Persia once again ruled the seas. The empire glittered like the jewels that flowed through its markets. Foreign envoys knelt before the peacock throne, marveling at a civilization reborn from dust. But Abbas was haunted. The sons he had destroyed left no worthy heir. His throne, magnificent as it was, had become a monument to his own loneliness. When he died in 1629, Persia mourned the passing of its greatest ruler. Yet beneath the mourning drums, an unease rippled through the empire. The architects, the generals, the merchant soul wondered the same thing. Who could possibly replace him? Abbas had forged unity through control, faith through fear, and prosperity through iron discipline. But empires are fragile things. Without the hand that holds them, the balance falters. The Silk Road still glittered. Isfahan still shone, but the first hairline cracks had begun to show, and beyond the horizon, unseen by Persia's golden domes, a darker age was waiting to descend. Twilight of the Peacock Throne, decline, intrigue, and the fall of Isfahan. Have you ever seen a candle that burns too brightly so fiercely that it devours itself before dawn? That was the Safavid Empire after Abbas the Great. The flame he had kindled still dazzled the world. But beneath its brilliance, the wax was melting fast. When Abbas died in 1629, he left behind a realm of unimaginable wealth and power, but also one balanced on the edge of a blade. The new Safavid was young, uncertain, and terrified of the shadow his grandfather had cast. Abbas's paranoia had not only killed his sons, but crippled the royal line. The boy who took the throne had grown up watching blood drip through the cracks of the palace walls. Power, to him, was not a crown, it was a curse. And so he ruled in fear, trusting no one, striking first before others could strike at him. The courts of Isfahan, once filled with poets and scholars, became arenas of suspicion. Ministers vanished overnight. Generals were executed for imagined crimes. The empire's strength, its order, its discipline, its unity began to unravel. The Ghulams, once loyal warriors molded by Abbas's vision, turned inward, consumed by luxury and corruption. The Kizilbash tribes, long humiliated and sidelined, waited for weakness to return. Beyond the palace walls, the people whispered of bad omens. Silk caravans slowed. Tax collectors grew greedier. The pulse of prosperity that once beat through Persia's veins began to falter. Yet from the outside, the Safavid Empire still appeared majestic. The great mosques of Isfahan still glittered under the desert sun. European visitors wrote of its dazzling markets and gentle courtyards, but they did not see the rot creeping through the heart of the empire, the silent decay that grows not from battle, but from stillness. By the mid-1600s, under Shah Abbas II, the empire saw a brief flicker of renewal. Abbas II was not the conqueror his namesake had been, but he was wise enough to understand the fragility of power. He encouraged trade, strengthened diplomacy with Europe, and kept the Ottomans at bay. For a moment, it seemed the Safavid phoenix might rise again, but the old fire was gone. The court's intrigues deepened, the military weakened, and faith itself, once the burning force that had unified Persia, became an empty ritual. The ulama, the religious scholars who once guided the Safavid vision of Shia identity, now grew entangled in politics and wealth. The line between piety and ambition blurred. Shi'ism, once the revolutionary banner of unity, began to harden into orthodoxy, its spiritual edge dulled by comfort. The empire that had been born of faith, now drowned in ceremony. And then came the moment no empire ever sees coming, the slow, quiet collapse that begins, not with invasion, but indifference. By the late 1600s, Persia was a kingdom of memory. The Safavid court grew detached from its people, living behind walls of marble and illusion. The Ghulams had become soft, their drills forgotten. Governors in distant provinces acted as kings in all but name. The tribal forces that once fought for the Shah's glory now sold their swords to whoever could pay. When Shah Suleiman ascended the throne in 1666, he inherited not an empire of ambition, but one of indulgence. He was intelligent but lethargic, a man who found more comfort in poetry and wine than in war. Ministers ruled in his name while corruption flourished unchecked. The Safavid navy rotted in its harbors. Trade routes once buzzing with silken spices, now emptied as Europeans found new maritime paths around the Cape of Good Hope. The Silk Road, the artery that had pumped life into Persia for centuries, fell silent. Still, the empire lingered on, its grandeur deceptive. its weakness hidden behind the facade of ritual and art. The mosques of Isfahan still echoed with prayer, but those prayers could not stop what was coming. The enemies of Persia were watching and waiting. To the northeast, a new power was rising. The Afghan tribes of Kandahar, hardened by mountain warfare and long resentful of Safavid rule. Among them, a fierce leader named Mir Wais Hotok would spark a rebellion that would shake the empire's foundations. The spark was small at first, a tax dispute, a local uprising. But when neglected, even a whisper becomes a storm. In 1709, the Afghans revolted. The Safavid court, drunk on its own ceremonies, dismissed the threat. What could a few tribesmen do against the empire of Isfahan? They never learned the answer, because they never tried to. The rebellion spread like fire through dry grass. Within a few short years, Afghanistan was lost, and the eastern frontier began to crumble. Then came Shah Sultan Hussein, the last of the Safavid line, a man both gentle and doomed. When he took the throne in 1694, he inherited a decaying world. His faith was sincere, but his will was weak. Under his rule, the court became a theatre of ritual and superstition. Ministers argued while provinces rebelled. The army, unpaid and undisciplined, fell apart by the 1720s. Isfahan, the shining heart of Persia, stood surrounded. Afghan forces under Mahmud Hotak marched through the empire, burning and plundering with almost no resistance. The Safavid army, once feared across continents, shattered in days. The great capital, with its golden domes and flowing canals, became a city under siege. Inside, starvation set in. The marble palaces turned to tombs. Mothers traded jewels for bread, and the once mighty Shah wept as his people starved. For 6 months, the siege dragged on. Disease spread through the streets. The soldiers guarding the walls deserted their posts, desperate to find food for their families. At last, in October 1722, the gates of Isfahan opened. Shah Sultan Hussein stepped out not as a conqueror, but as a supplicant. He handed his crown to Mahmud Hotak, the Afghan warlord who had once been his subject. The Safavid Empire, born of faith and reborn through power, now died in humiliation. The fall of Isfahan was not just the collapse of a dynasty, it was the end of an age. Persia's Renaissance had become its requiem. The great Safavid dream that had united faith, art, and empire crumbled into dust. The domes still stood, the poems still sang, but their meaning had faded. And yet, history has a cruel way of never ending where it should. Because even as Persia lay broken under Afghan rule, a new figure was rising in the shadows, a soldier with the soul of a conqueror and the fire of a ghost. He would take back what had been lost. His name was Nader, and his vengeance would shake the world. Nader Shah, the sword of vengeance and the last glory of Persia. Have you ever seen a nation rise from ashes, not through faith or diplomacy, but through raw, merciless will? Persia, shattered and humiliated under Afghan rule, seemed destined to vanish into history's graveyard. Its city starved, its nobility scattered, its faith mocked by invaders who had once been its subjects. But sometimes, when everything collapses, destiny forges a man as hard and ruthless as the ruin itself. That man was Nader. He was not born to silk or ceremony. Nader came from the harsh steppes of Khorasan, a land where survival was a daily battle against wind, hunger, and rival tribes. His father was a humble shepherd. His youth was spent in poverty so severe that he often sold his own labor to buy food. Yet within that struggling boy burned a fury too great for obscurity. When Afghan raiders tore through his homeland, killing and enslaving his people, Nader did not mourn, he vowed revenge. By his 20s, he had gathered a band of warriors as fierce as himself. They were outcastsmen who had lost everything and had nothing left to fear. Nader's leadership was brutal but magnetic. He led from the front, his sword flashing like lightning in battle. His eyes burning with the certainty of a man who believed he was chosen not by God, but by fate itself. Under his command, the ragged band grew into an army, and whispers spread across Persia. A lion of Khorasan had risen. In 1726. When the broken Safavid prince, Tahmasp II, fled Afghan-occupied Isfahan, he found refuge under Nader's protection. The warrior and the fallen prince formed an uneasy alliance. Nader pledged to restore the Safavid throne, but everyone knew who truly commanded the soldiers. Tahmasp was a figurehead. Nader was the storm. The campaign that followed was swift, ruthless, and glorious. Nader's forces swept through Khorasan and Fars, smashing Afghan garrisons with tactics they had never seen before: swift cavalry charges, disciplined formations, precision in chaos. His army moved like a blade through silk. In 1729, at the Battle of Damgan, Nader met the Afghan ruler Ashraf Hotak. The clash was apocalyptic: dust, clouds, cannon fire, the air thick with screams. But when it ended, Persia was free. The Afghans fled, their empire in ashes. For the first time in nearly a decade, the banners of Persia rose once more over Isfahan. The people hailed Nader as a savior, the restorer of their pride. Yet in his eyes, there was no peace, only hunger for more. He had liberated Persia, but liberation was never his true goal. Power was at first. He kept the facade. He placed the Safavid prince back on the throne, calling himself the loyal commander. But with each victory, his shadow grew. The people began to whisper a dangerous truth. Nader was no servant of Kings Hay, was a king in waiting. When Tahmasp, desperate to reclaim authority, led a disastrous campaign against the Ottomans, Nader returned, furious, accusing him of incompetence. In 1732, he deposed the Safavid prince and crowned Tahmasp's infant son, Abbas III, as puppet ruler, with himself as regent. It was Nader ruled absolutely, yet wore the mask of legitimacy. But masks can only last so long. 3 years later, Nader cast off all pretense. In 1736, on the plains of Mugan, surrounded by his generals and nobles, he called a grand assembly. The courtiers, trembling, proclaimed him Shah of Persia. The Safavid dynasty was dead. A new one, the Afsharid, had been born. Nader Shah's coronation was unlike any other. There were no grand poems or mystical invocations, only steel and silence. The man who had risen from dust now ruled from a throne of conquest. But he wanted more than a crown. He wanted to restore Persia's dominance, to make it feared again from the Indus to the Mediterranean. His campaigns were relentless. First, he turned west, crushing the Ottomans and reclaiming lost Persian lands, including Baghdad and Mosul. Then he looked east to India, where the fabled riches of the Mughal Empire glittered like a promise. In 1739, he crossed the Hindu Kush with an army hardened by endless war. The Mughals, bloated by decadence, could not comprehend the ferocity of this new conqueror. At Karnal, near Delhi, Nader's disciplined troops annihilated a Mughal force 3 times their size. The gates of Delhi opened before him. What followed was both triumph and tragedy. At first, Nader entered the city in peace, honored by the terrified Mughal emperor. But a single spark of riot, a misunderstanding, ignited his wrath. When his soldiers were attacked in the streets, Nader unleashed vengeance. For a single night, the city of Delhi became a furnace of slaughter. Tens of thousands perished. When dawn came, Nader ordered the killing to stop, but the damage was done. He rode through the streets in silence, the jewels of the peacock throne glittering in his saddlebag, his face carved in stone. He left India laden with unimaginable wealth, so much golden treasure that Persia's taxes were abolished for 3 years. Yet what he brought home was not prosperity, was madness. The further Nader rose, the more he trusted no one. He executed loyal generals, blinded his own son, and lived in constant suspicion. The empire he rebuilt now trembled under the weight of his paranoia. By the time he returned to Khorasan, Nader Shah had become a man consumed by his own legend. He camped not in palaces but in fortresses, surrounded by guards and fear. When his soldiers rebelled against his cruelty in 1747, one night they entered his tent and found him sleeping. They did not hesitate. The blade that had once carved an empire now turned on its master. Nader, Shah, conqueror of conquerors. The last great sword of Persia was dead. His death sent shockwaves through the land. Without his will to bind it, the empire shattered within months. The lands he had conquered broke away, the throne fell into chaos, and Persia once again fragmented into warlord states. Yet his name lived unspoken with awe, fear, and sorrow. Because in Nader Shah's rise and fall lay the final truth of the Safavid legacy. The dream of a united, glorious Persia had not died with faith, nor with empire, it died with trust. Every Shah since Ismail had built unity through power, not through understanding, and in the end, power devoured them all. Still, history is never kind enough to give the final word. From the ruins Nader left behind, a new Persia would one day rise again, not with swords or saints, but with poets, thinkers, and reformers who would rebuild the nation's soul. But that is a story still waiting beyond the shadow of the peacock throne. From ruins to revival, the legacy and rebirth of the Persian identity. Have you ever seen the spirit of a nation survive the death of its kings? The swords of the Safavids had long turned to rust, their palaces to ruins. Yet the idea of Persia, the soul of Iran, refused to die. After Nader Shah's violent end in 1747, chaos returned like an old ghost. The Afsharid generals carved up the land among themselves, while rival tribes battled over the remnants of the empire. But beneath the noise of civil war, something deeper was happening, the slow rebirth of an identity that could not be conquered by blades or burned by time. The decades after Nader's death were years of darkness and confusion. Warlords fought for scraps of the vanished glory. The once unified empire splintered into provinces ruled by petty kings, each claiming to be the true heir of Persia. Cities that had once hummed with scholars and silk merchants became ghostly echoes of their former brilliance. Isfahan's domes still caught the sunlight, but its markets were empty. Caravans no longer crossed its roads. It seemed that the light of Iran, after centuries of struggle, had finally gone out, and yet it hadn't. Because empires fall but culture endures. Persian poetry continued to be recited by candlelight in quiet homes. Scholars copied the verses of Hafiz and Sodi, preserving them as lifelines to a nobler past. In every village, the language of Persia still sang on the tongues of its people, unbroken, defiant, proud. The empire might have collapsed, but the Persian spirit, artistic, spiritual, and stubbornly alive, survived in its people's hearts. By the late 18th century, out of the ruins, another leader began to rise, a man far different from the Safavid mystics or Nader's iron will. His name was Karim Khan Zand. He was no conqueror thirsting for glory. He was weary of bloodshed. The people were exhausted, too. When Karim Khan took power in 1751, he declared himself not Shah, but Vakil al-Raya, the representative of the people. For the first time in generations, a ruler of Persia sought not divine mandate or vengeance, but peace. Karim Khan moved the capital to Shiraz, a city of gardens and poets, where he rebuilt not armies, but lives. He lowered taxes, encouraged trade, and invited artisans back to work. Under his rule, Persia began to breathe again. The streets of Shiraz filled with laughter, the scent of roses, the music of flutes. The Safavid dream of a renaissance returned, but this time not as empire, but as humanity. The people began to feel Persian again, not because of conquest, but because of culture. Foreign travelers who came to Shiraz during Karim Khan's reign spoke of its peace and hospitality. They wrote that the Vakil ruled with fairness and restraint, that the people adored him. For a fleeting generation, Persia found its balance again. Yet peace, like the scent of a rose, never lasts forever. When Karim Khan died in 1779, his heirs fell to infighting. Once again, the land descended into chaos, and a new power born from the northern tribes began to rise. That power was the Qajar dynasty. When Uga Muhammad Khan Qajar seized power in 1794, he brought with him both brutality and ambition. He reconquered Isfahan, crushed rivals, and declared himself Shah of Iran. His methods were merciless. He was said to have blinded thousands of captives. But his goal was clear: to reunite Persia once more. Under the Qajars, the empire regained its form, if not its former glory. Tehran became the new capital, a modest town, transformed into the beating heart of a reborn state. Yet the world had changed. The age of conquerors was over. The age of empires, European empires, had begun. Russia advanced from the north, Britain from the south, and Persia, weakened by centuries of internal strife, stood between them like a wounded lion. Wars with Russia in the 19th century tore away territories in the Caucasus. The Treaty of Turkmenchia in 1828 forced Persia to surrender vast lands, pay crippling reparations, and accept humiliation. The once mighty descendants of Ismail and Abbas now faced the cold reality of modern geopolitics. But even in defeat, Persia adapted. The Qajar era became a strange mixture of decline and rebirth. European influence brought printing presses, newspapers, and schools. Persian intellectuals began to question not only their rulers but the very nature of rule itself. Ideas of liberty, justice, and reform filtered into the bazaars and coffeehouses. The poets once again found their voices, this time not to praise kings, but to awaken the nation. By the late 1800s, a quiet revolution was brewing in the hearts of ordinary Iranians. The dream of a strong, just Persia rooted in its Shia faith but yearning for modernity was alive again. When the constitutional revolution erupted in 1905, demanding a parliament and the rule of law, it was the final echo of the Safavid legacy transformed. The faith of Ismail, the discipline of Abbas, and the resilience of a people who refused to vanish. Persia had lost empires, battles, and borders, but it had found something far greater: its identity. The Safavids had given it a soul, Shi'ism as a pillar of unity. The later dynasties, through chaos and reform, had given it endurance. And from all of that came the modern nation of Iran, a country not defined by conquest, but by continuity. Even today, when one walks through the squares of Isfahan, beneath the turquoise domes and echoing arches, one can feel the heartbeat of that history, the voices of the Safavid builders, the whispers of Abbas's soldiers, the lament of Nader's victims, and the poetry of Shiraz. They all linger in the air, because the story of the Safavid Empire was never just about power or faith. It was about the eternal struggle of a civilization to define itself, to rise, fall, and rise again. The Shia ascendancy they began became the cornerstone of a nation's belief. The Persian Renaissance they ignited continues in its art, its poetry, its spirit. Every chapter of blood and brilliance left an imprint that shaped what Iran would become: a land that endures, not because of kings, but because of memory. And so, as the sun sets on the ruins of the old empires and the domes of Isfahan glow gold one last time, we are reminded of a truth, that the Safavids, the poets, and the people of Persia all understood that civilizations do not die, they transform. Their bodies may crumble, their crowns may fall, but their souls remain, carried forward by those who remember. The Safavid Empire is gone, but its shadow still walks in every verse, every mosque, every heartbeat of Iran. And in that shadow, the story continues, forever unfinished, forever reborn. Eternal fire, the Safavid legacy, and the soul of modern Iran. Have you ever wondered how an empire's heartbeat can echo across centuries, long after its throne has turned to dust? The Safavid Empire may have fallen in the 18th century, but its pulse never stopped. It beat still in the prayers whispered in mosques, in the lines of Persian poetry, in the colors of Isfahan's tiles, and in the pride of a people who refuse to forget who they are. This final chapter is not about kings or battles, it's about what survived them. When the last Safavid crown was lost, Persia seemed finished. But the Safavids had done something no empire before them ever had. They had woven the identity of a nation from the threads of faith, culture, and language. Their decision to make Shi'ism the state religion did more than define an era, it defined a people. From then on, Persia was not just a place, it was a worldview, a spiritual homeland built on unity through belief. That identity became the shield that protected Iran from dissolution. When the Mongols came, Persia adapted. When the Ottomans pressed, Persia endured. When colonial powers carved up Asia, Iran still stood battered, but unbroken. Every dynasty that followed, from the Qajars to the Pahlavis, and even into the modern Islamic Republic, stood in the shadow of that Safavid foundation. The architectural glory of Isfahan became the model for national pride. The Persian language, that the Safavids revived, became the glue that held provinces and peoples together. The concept of Iran as a Shia nation-state distinct from both the Sunni Ottoman world and the Hindu Mughal one was the Safavid gift that outlasted time. They had not merely ruled the country. They had created a civilization's second birth. Even the political lessons of their rise and fall endured. When modern Iranian thinkers debated the balance between religion and power, they were really continuing a conversation that began with Shi'a Islam. When later reformers like Amir Kabir in the 19th century or Mossadegh in the 20th tried to blend faith with governance, their struggle mirrored that same Safavid tension, the eternal dance between the sword and the prayer mat, between divine right and human justice. The Safavid story was also a cultural resurrection. Before them, Persian art had nearly vanished under waves of foreign rule. After them, it blossomed once more: miniature paintings, calligraphy, carpets that told stories in silk. Even today, an Iranian craftsman weaving a rug or a poet reciting a verse from Rumi is unknowingly extending that same flame. But perhaps their greatest legacy lies not in what they built, but in what they preserved: the idea of Persia as a bridge between worlds, between East and West, between faith and philosophy, between the ancient and the eternal. The Safavid court did not just produce kings, it produced thinkers who debated science beside theology, poets who wrote of love and loss, and artisans who saw beauty as divine reflection. When the modern traveler stands in Isfahan's Nakshi Jahan Square, gazing at the turquoise domes that shimmer beneath the sun, they are not just looking at stone and color, they are standing in the echo of a civilization that refused to die. Every tile bears witness to an empire that turned faith into art, and art into immortality. And yet, the Safavid legacy is not only about splendor, it is also a warning. The same faith that united millions also divided empires. Their rigid enforcement of Shia orthodoxy created both identity and isolation. Their rise through passion and fall through pride became a mirror that Iran would look into again and again. Each generation has faced the same question the Safavids once did. Can a nation balance faith and freedom, unity and diversity, past and progress? Today, that question still burns in the heart of modern Iran. The echo of the Safavids lives not in palaces, but in every debate over belief and reform, in every poet's rebellion, in every call for renewal. Their empire has long since turned to history, but their spirit has turned into destiny. More than 500 years after Ismail rode into Tabriz and proclaimed a new order under the red banner of the 12 Imams, the identity he forged still shapes the nation that stands in his shadow. The Persian Renaissance he ignited continues to shimmer through art, architecture, and pride. The Shia ascendancy he built continues to define Iran's place in the world, and the dream of unity through spirit, though scarred by time, remains unbroken perhaps. That is what makes the story of the Safavid Empire more than just history. It is prophecy fulfilled and broken, a cycle of rise and fall that mirrors the human soul itself. For every Ismail who dreams too high, there will be an Abbas who builds anew. For every empire that burns, there will be a poet who remembers the light dot. So when the call to prayer rises over Isfahan at sunset, and the domes glow gold against the dying light, remember, you are hearing not just the sound of faith, but the voice of a civilization that refused to fade. The Safavids may be gone, but their spirit endures, vast as the desert, patient as time, eternal as the fire that once burned in the heart of Persia. The story ends here, but the legacy never does, because the Safavid Empire, in truth, never fell. It lives wherever Persian hearts still beat, wherever faith meets art, and wherever the past still whispers to the future, rise again.